A woman shelters a freezing mountain man, but next morning, he asked her to be his wife. In the middle of a deadly snowstorm, a lonely widow drags a stranger from her porch. Half frozen, barely breathing. She only wanted to save a life, not change her own. But when dawn breaks, that quiet man by her fire looks her in the eyes and asks for her hand. Before she can catch her breath, riders thunder up the trail, deputies claiming he's a killer on the run. Now her cabin becomes a prison of secrets, faith, and fear. Is she protecting an innocent man or hiding a murderer? The mountain holds its breath, the church bell tolls, and the law closes in. One woman's mercy could cost her everything she has left. Will she choose the law that broke her heart, or the love that might save it? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled like a wounded beast across South Park Basin, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending snow spinning in wild eddies past frosted window panes. Ellen Wade pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stirred the meager flames in her pot-bellied stove. The harsh Colorado winter had come early this year, catching many unprepared, including herself, with barely enough firewood stacked against the cabin's outer wall to last another week. Her faithful hound Bear lay curled near the hearth, his chin resting on massive paws. The warmth from the fire cast dancing shadows across his brindled coat. Ellen envied his ability to sleep through the storm's fury. She hadn't truly rested in days, spending her nights listening to the wind's mournful song and fighting memories of winters past, winters when she wasn't alone. Suddenly, Bear's head snapped up. His ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ellen froze, wooden spoon suspended over her pot of beans. The dog scrambled to his feet, hackles rising as he bounded to the door. "What is it, boy?" Ellen whispered, her heart quickening. Bear's bark exploded through the cabin, not his usual warning at passing deer or coyotes, but something urgent and demanding. Ellen set down her spoon and reached for the rifle she kept above the mantel. Bear's barking grew frantic, punctuated by whines and scratching at the door. In all their years together, she'd never heard him make such sounds. "Hush now," she commanded, but the dog ignored her. The wind shrieked louder, and something thudded against her porch. Bear's barking reached a fever pitch. Ellen's hands trembled as she gripped the rifle. Since losing Thomas and little Sarah, she'd grown accustomed to facing danger alone. But something in Bear's desperate cries told her this was different. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the door. The wind nearly tore it from her grasp, driving needles of snow into her face. Bear burst onto the porch, and Ellen squinted through the swirling white. There, sprawled face down in a drift, lay a man. "Dear Lord," she breathed, lowering the rifle. Bear circled the still form, whining and nudging it with his nose. Ellen knelt beside the stranger, her fingers searching for a pulse beneath his ice-crusted beard. The faintest flutter met her touch. He was alive, barely. "Bear, help me," she grunted, hooking her arms under the man's shoulders. The dog gripped the stranger's coat in his teeth, and together they dragged him across the threshold. Snow melted from his clothes, forming dark puddles on her clean floor. Ellen kicked the door shut against the storm and rushed to the stranger's side. His clothes were frozen stiff, his face blue-tinged beneath its coating of frost. Working quickly, she cut away his frozen coat with shearing scissors, her practiced hands making swift work of the ice-hard leather and wool. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, rattling breaths. "Stay with me, stranger," she muttered, hurrying to pile quilts around him. These were her best quilts, the ones she'd sewn during long winter nights, each stitch a prayer for peace she no longer believed would come. Now they might mean the difference between life and death for this unknown man. She positioned him near the hearth, close enough to warm him, but not so near as to shock his frozen body. Bear settled beside him, lending his own heat through the blankets. Ellen touched the stranger's face, still dangerously cold. Moving to the stove, she filled a pot with snow from outside and set it to melt. While she waited, she studied her unexpected guest. He was lean but strong-looking, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. A hunter or trapper, most likely, caught in the storm's sudden fury. A leather pouch hung from his belt, decorated with Ute beadwork. The water warmed, and Ellen added dried meat and herbs to make a thin broth. Kneeling beside the unconscious man, she lifted his head and pressed the cup to his blue-tinged lips. "Drink," she ordered, letting a few drops trickle into his mouth. He coughed weakly but swallowed. "That's it. Little more now." As she tended him, words she hadn't spoken in years rose unbidden to her lips. "Lord, if you're still listening, if you even care anymore, help him live through this night." The prayer felt strange, like a rusty key turning in a long, locked door. Since losing Sarah, Ellen had sealed away her faith along with her daughter's tiny dresses and well-worn Bible stories. What God would take a child, leaving her mother to face endless, empty days? But now, watching this stranger fight for breath, something stirred in her heart, something she thought had died with her family. Through the long hours, Ellen kept her vigil. She fed him sips of broth, changed cold compresses for warm ones, and watched the color slowly return to his face. Bear remained steadfast beside them both, his solid presence a comfort in the storm-wrapped night. Near dawn, the stranger's breathing finally steadied into a natural rhythm. Ellen sank back on her heels, exhausted but relieved. Outside, the blizzard still raged, but inside her cabin, a life had been saved. She added wood to the stove and settled into her rocking chair, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall. Who was he? What twist of fate or divine providence had led him to collapse on her doorstep of all places? The questions tumbled through her mind as she rocked, her fingers automatically smoothing the worn fabric of her apron. Bear rested his head on her knee, his brown eyes full of understanding. Ellen scratched behind his ears, grateful for his warning that had allowed her to find the stranger in time. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did good." The first pale light of morning filtered through the frost-rimed windows, casting a ghostly glow across the cabin's interior. The stranger stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Ellen studied his face, peaceful now in sleep, and wondered what story lay behind his presence here. Her gaze fell on the Ute-made pouch at his belt, unusual for a white man to carry such a thing. Clearly there was more to him than met the eye. She rose stiffly and went to check his clothes, now draped near the stove to dry. In the pocket of his coat, she found a small leather wallet. Opening it revealed a carefully folded paper, a letter addressed to Adriel Hale in elegant handwriting. So, her mysterious guest had a name. "Adriel," she whispered, testing the sound of it. A biblical name, the angel of death in some traditions, though this Adriel had come closer to death than dealing it. The wind's howl rose again, rattling the windows in their frames. Ellen moved to add more wood to the fire, her mind turning over this strange twist in her solitary life. For years, she'd shut herself away from the world, nursing her grief and anger. Now, whether by accident or divine design, her isolation had been breached. She looked at the sleeping man, Adriel, and felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. The simple act of helping another soul had awakened something she thought long dead. It wasn't trust, not yet, but perhaps it was the beginning of hope. As the storm raged on outside, Ellen settled back into her chair and began to pray again. Not the bitter questions she'd hurled at heaven since Sarah's death, but simple words of gratitude for the chance to save a life. Bear dozed at her feet, and Adriel slept peacefully by the fire, while the wind sang its wild song across the basin. Dawn's weak light struggled through the snowfall, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Ellen had survived another night, but this time she wasn't alone. Whatever God's purpose was in sending this stranger to her door, she would wait to see it revealed. For now, it was enough that she had answered mercy's call in the heart of the storm. Morning crept into the cabin like a timid creature, pale light filtering through the frost-traced windows. The glass panes held delicate patterns of ice. Nature's own lacework spread across the transparent surface. Inside, the air hung heavy with wood smoke and the lingering scents of leather and wet wool. Adriel stirred beneath the pile of quilts, his eyes fluttering open. His cracked lips moved in silent prayer, but the words grew stronger, whispered into the quiet morning. Lord, forgive me. James, brother, I should have. His voice faltered, rough with emotion and weakness. Should have been there. Ellen froze by the stove, where she'd been stirring the morning's coffee. Her hands stilled on the pot handle, careful not to let the metal scrape and reveal she'd heard his private moment. The raw pain in his voice struck a chord deep within her. She recognized that tone, the sound of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. Pretending she'd noticed nothing, Ellen let the pot clank slightly as she lifted it from the stove. The noise roused Adriel fully, and he struggled to sit up among the quilts. Easy there, Ellen said, keeping her voice matter-of-fact. You're safe, but you need to take things slow. She poured coffee into a tin cup, adding extra water to weaken it for his fragile state. Think you can manage some of this? Adriel nodded, accepting the cup with trembling hands. Much obliged, ma'am. His voice was clearer now, though still rough. I reckon I owe you my life. You owe me nothing, Ellen replied, turning back to the stove where a pot of thin stew simmered. Any Christian soul would have done the same. The words tasted strange in her mouth. How long had it been since she'd claimed that faith for herself? Nevertheless, Adriel paused to sip the coffee, color slowly returning to his face. I aim to thank you proper once I'm back on my feet. Ellen ladled stew into a bowl, adding an extra spoonful of precious dried vegetables. What you aim to do is rest and recover. Storm's still blowing out there, though not as fierce as last night. She handed him the bowl. Think you can manage this? Adriel took the bowl carefully, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. His hands were calloused but gentle, telling their own story of a life lived working hard in the wilderness. Yes'm. Thank you. While he ate, Adriel's eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the details of her home. Ellen felt suddenly self-conscious of the sparse furnishings, the simple table with its single chair, the neat row of tools hanging on the wall, the shelf with its few books. His gaze lingered on the empty space by the door, where a man's boots should have stood, then shifted to the small trunk in the corner, where Ellen knew Sarah's things still lay carefully wrapped. She could see him piecing together the story. A woman alone, everything in its place with precise tidiness, no sign of family or companionship save the old hound dog. Ellen busied herself with straightening already straight things, avoiding his thoughtful gaze. The wind's howl gradually lessened as morning wore into afternoon. Ellen checked the woodbox and frowned at its dwindling contents. "Bear," she called to the dog, "come help me fetch some wood." Adriel set aside his empty bowl and began pushing back the quilts. "Let me help with that, ma'am." "You'll do no such thing," Ellen said firmly. "You can barely sit up straight." But Adriel was already struggling to his feet, swaying like a sapling in strong wind. "Please, I can't just lie here while you work. Wouldn't be right." Ellen recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and sighed. "At least put on these." She handed him a pair of dry boots she'd found in her husband's old trunk. They were the first things of Thomas's she'd touched in years. Together they made their way to the door, Adriel moving slowly but determined. The wind had died down enough to see the woodpile against the barn wall, though snow still swirled in the air. Ellen stepped out first, breaking a path through the fresh drifts. Adriel followed, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He managed 3 steps before his legs buckled. Ellen lunged forward, catching his arm before he could fall. He was lighter than she expected, too many winter days with too little food showing in his lean frame. "Steady now," she murmured, suddenly aware of his warmth against her side, the way he leaned into her support. Something stirred in her chest, not the sharp pain of loss she'd lived with for so long, but a softer ache, like a bruise beginning to heal. "I'm sorry," Adriel whispered, his face flushed with more than cold. "Thought I was stronger than this." "No shame in needing help sometimes," Ellen replied, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. She helped him back inside, settling him once more by the fire. Bear followed them in, shaking snow from his coat. "Rest now," she ordered. "I'll fetch the wood myself." This time Adriel didn't argue, though she could see it cost him pride to stay behind. Ellen worked quickly, making several trips until the woodbox was full again. Each time she came inside, she found Adriel's eyes following her movements, something like admiration in his gaze. As evening drew near, Ellen prepared another meal, more stew, stretched thin but hot and filling. She brought a bowl to Adriel, then sat in her rocker with her own portion. The wind had picked up again, moaning around the cabin's eaves like a lost soul seeking shelter. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the crack of burning wood and Bear's contented sighs from his place by the fire. Ellen found herself studying Adriel's face in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both smiles and sorrows. There was something peaceful about sharing space with another person again, even a stranger. The cabin felt warmer somehow, as if his presence had driven back more than just the physical cold. Adriel finished his stew and set the bowl aside carefully. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not just for the meal, but for everything. Most folks wouldn't take in a stranger in weather like this." Ellen shrugged, uncomfortable with his gratitude. "Like I said, any Christian soul would have done the same." "No." Adriel shook his head slowly. "They wouldn't. I've seen enough of the world to know that mercy like yours is rare indeed." Ellen looked away, her hands busying themselves with her mending. She wasn't ready to examine the feelings his words stirred up, the way they made her question her own bitter withdrawal from the world. Instead, she focused on her needle, drawing it through the fabric with precise stitches as the storm winds continued their lonely song overhead. The evening deepened around them, comfortable in its shared silence. Now and then, Adriel would stir to add another log to the fire, his movements growing steadier but still weak. Ellen continued her mending, stealing glances at her unexpected guest when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something about him that spoke of deep waters, pain and regret in his earlier prayers, but also a gentle strength in the way he pushed himself to help despite his weakness. Bear moved between them, accepting gentle pats from both, his presence a bridge across the quiet. Outside, the storm showed no sign of letting up, but inside the cabin, something subtle had shifted. The lonely walls that had echoed with Ellen's solitude for so long now held the warmth of shared space, shared breath, shared humanity. As Ellen rocked and sewed, she felt the first tentative stirrings of connection, fragile as spring ice, but undeniably present. She wasn't ready to name it, this careful thing growing in the space between stranger and savior, but she could feel it there, warm as the firelight painting shadows on the cabin walls. The wind's voice rose and fell, but its power to chill had lessened. In its place, an unspoken bond of gratitude began to weave itself in the firelit quiet, strong as the quilts that had saved Adriel's life, gentle as the mercy that had opened Ellen's door to a stranger's need. Morning came with a gentler face. The howling wind that had terrorized the basin for days finally softened to whispers, and the heavy snowfall thinned to lazy flurries that danced in the pale winter light. Ellen stood at her frost-laced window, watching the transformed landscape. The storm had left everything buried under deep drifts, the familiar shapes of her homestead smoothed into rolling white hills. The sound of coughing drew her attention back to her unexpected guest. Adriel sat up slowly from his bed of quilts by the hearth, his movements careful but stronger than the day before. Color had returned to his face, though shadows of exhaustion still lingered under his eyes. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Looks like the Lord's seen fit to ease up on the weather." Ellen nodded, moving to stoke the fire. "Storm's mostly past. Might be able to make it to your own place soon, once the drifts settle some." Adriel watched her work, his expression thoughtful. "Before I go, I mean to repay your kindness. Saw your woodpiles running low, and there's work needs doing around here." "That's not necessary," Ellen protested, straightening up from the fireplace. "You're still recovering." "I'm well enough for honest work," Adriel insisted quietly. He rose to his feet, steady now where yesterday he'd swayed. "Won't sit idle while there's things need tending." Ellen recognized that same stubborn set to his jaw from yesterday. "At least eat something first," she conceded, moving to put coffee on the stove. After a simple breakfast of cornbread and the last of the stew, Adriel borrowed Thomas's old axe and headed out to the woodpile. Ellen watched from the window as he worked, his movements deliberate and efficient despite his recent illness. He'd shed his coat in spite of the cold, and she could see the practiced swing of someone who'd spent years working with tools. She busied herself with indoor chores, but found her attention drawn repeatedly to the steady rhythm of the axe and the growing pile of split wood. When she stepped out later to feed the chickens, she noticed something different about the barn. The roof beam that had been slowly sagging all winter had been braced and secured, the work so neat she might have missed it if she hadn't known exactly how the barn had looked before. Moving closer, she discovered more repairs she hadn't asked for. The corral gate that had been hanging crooked since the last big storm now swung true on mended hinges. Even the loose boards on the chicken coop had been fixed, the gaps that let in drafts carefully sealed. She found Adriel by the woodpile, stacking the last of the split logs. His breath clouded in the cold air, but his movements were sure and strong. He'd accomplished more in a morning than she'd managed in months of struggling alone. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the winter chill. "Wanted to? It's little enough, compared to what you did for me." Ellen shook her head. "Come in and warm up. Coffee's hot." Inside, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table. Adriel took the offered chair while she settled into her rocker. Bear sprawled contentedly between them. "Been trapping these mountains going on 15 years now," Adriel said after a while, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the still air of the cabin. "Good living, if you're careful and know the ways of things. Trade my pelts down in Denver when I can, or sometimes over to Fairplay." Ellen listened as he spoke of life in the high country, the secret places where beaver built their dams, the tracks of elk through deep snow, the way weather moved across the peaks. His words painted pictures of a world both harsh and beautiful, one she'd seen only from the edges of her homestead. "There's a Ute family camps up by Thunder Creek most winters," he continued, something softening in his expression. "Good people. Help them with meat when hunting's poor, trade for beadwork sometimes. Their youngest boy, he's got a way with horses that's something to see." The way he spoke of them carried respect and genuine warmth, but Ellen caught an undertone of something else, a weight of regret or sorrow he seemed to carry. It showed in the way his eyes would sometimes drift to middle distance, as if seeing something beyond the cabin walls. Yet there was dignity in how he bore that burden, whatever it was. It showed in his careful work, in the gentle way he'd treated Bear, in how he spoke of others with simple kindness. Ellen found herself drawn to that quiet strength, even as her cautious heart warned her to keep her distance. The short winter day was already fading toward dusk when Adriel finished his coffee. He rose and moved to the center of the room, then slowly knelt. Ellen watched, startled, as he bowed his head in prayer. "Lord," he began, his voice soft but clear, "I thank you for the shelter you provided in my hour of need, for the kindness of a stranger who became an angel of mercy, for the warmth of this hearth and the grace of human compassion. Help me to be worthy of such blessings, and to share them as freely as they were given to me." Ellen turned away quickly, but not before Adriel's words pierced something long frozen within her. She felt tears threatening and blinked hard, trying to hold them back. How long had it been since she'd heard anyone pray with such simple faith? How many years had she kept her own prayers locked away, bitter at a God who'd taken her family? But watching Adriel's quiet reverence, the careful way he'd repaid kindness with kindness, stirred something she'd thought long dead. A fragile tendril of trust, not just in human decency, but in the possibility that God's providence worked through human hands, even broken, doubting ones like hers. She busied herself with the stove, letting the clatter of pans hide her uneven breathing. Behind her, she heard Adriel rise from his prayers and move to add wood to the fire. The familiar domestic sounds slowly steadied her, but the tears that had threatened still burned behind her eyes. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky. The flurries had stopped entirely now, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that reflected the first emerging stars. Inside the cabin, warmth and silence wrapped around them like a quilt, comfortable in its shared solitude. Bear stretched and moved to lay his head on Ellen's foot, his solid presence anchoring her to the moment. She looked down at him, then across at Adriel, who sat quietly watching the flames. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, the careful way he held himself, as if carrying both strength and weariness in equal measure. In that moment, Ellen felt the walls she'd built around her heart shift ever so slightly. Not crumbling, not yet, but a tiny crack had formed, letting in a whisper of something she'd forgotten how to feel. Hope, perhaps, or faith, or simply the recognition that even in the depths of winter, warmth could still be found in unexpected places. The evening deepened around them, filled with the soft sounds of the fire and Bear's contented sighs. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving behind a profound silence that spoke of peace after storm, of rest after struggle, of mercy freely given and gratefully received. Dawn crept over the snow-laden peaks, painting the world in shades of pearl and gold. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney like a gentle prayer rising to meet the brightening sky. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a transformed landscape, pristine, unmarked, full of possibility. Adriel worked steadily at the woodpile, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He'd been up since before first light, determined to finish the task he'd set for himself. The stack of split wood had grown impressive, enough to last Ellen well into the coming weeks. His shoulders ached pleasantly from the work, a reminder of strength returning after his brush with death in the blizzard. Inside the cabin, Ellen moved with practiced efficiency, the familiar morning routine grounding her against the strange flutter in her chest whenever she glanced out the window. The cast-iron stove radiated welcome heat as she worked, the scent of brewing coffee mingling with the promise of fresh biscuits. She'd found a precious bit of bacon stored away in the cold pantry, a luxury she normally saved for special occasions, though she couldn't say exactly what made this morning feel special enough to warrant it. Bear lounged near the stove, his tail thumping occasionally against the plank floor whenever Ellen passed nearby. The dog had taken to Adriel with surprising ease, something that both pleased and unsettled her. Bear was usually more cautious with strangers. The biscuits had just turned golden brown when Adriel came in, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, and Ellen noticed how the color brought out the warmth in his dark eyes. He'd regained his color after the fever, though his face remained lean and weathered from years in the high country. "Smells like heaven in here," he said, moving to wash up at the basin she'd set out. Ellen ducked her head, oddly pleased by the simple compliment. "Just biscuits and bacon. Nothing fancy." "After trail cooking, ma'am, your plain fare tastes like a feast." He dried his hands on the offered towel, then helped her set out plates and cups without being asked, as if they'd shared this morning ritual 100 times before. They settled at the small table, sunlight streaming through frost-rimed windows to pool on the scrubbed wood between them. Ellen poured coffee while Adriel said grace, his words simple but heartfelt. The familiar prayer stirred something in her chest, not the sharp pain of loss she usually felt at such moments, but something softer, like an old wound beginning to heal. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, broken only by Bear's hopeful sighs as he watched the bacon disappear. Ellen found herself studying Adriel when he wasn't looking, the careful way he handled her mother's old china cup, how he'd remembered she preferred her coffee with just a touch of milk, the thoughtful set of his mouth as he gazed out at the morning. Something had shifted between them in these few days. The stranger she'd dragged in from the storm had become familiar. Not just in his ways around her home, but in how his presence filled the empty spaces she'd grown so used to, she'd almost forgotten they were there. Adriel set his cup down suddenly, his expression turning serious. "Mrs. Wade, Ellen." He cleared his throat, and she noticed his hands weren't quite steady. "I've been thinking on something, and I reckon it's best to speak plain." Ellen felt her breath catch, though she couldn't have said why. "What is it?" He met her eyes directly, and the quiet intensity there made her heart skip. "Mrs. Wade, I'd ask you to be my wife." The words hung in the warm air between them, heavy as thunder before a storm. Ellen's hand froze halfway to her cup, certain she must have misheard. The morning sun suddenly seemed too bright, the room too small, her skin too tight to contain the rush of feelings that swept through her. I beg your pardon?" she managed finally, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Adriel's face remained earnest, though a flush had crept up his neck. "I know it's sudden-like, Maybe even foolish, seeing as we've known each other such a short time." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I've lived long enough to know when God's hand is at work in a thing." Ellen's laugh came out slightly wild, more from shock than humor. "God's hand? Mr. Hale, you barely know me. A few days of shelter from a storm hardly seems like divine intervention." "Maybe not," he agreed softly, "but I've spent 15 years drifting these mountains, trading and trapping, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Never wanted to, truth be told, not since—" He broke off, something dark flickering behind his eyes before he continued. "But I'm tired of drifting. Tired of coming home to an empty camp, of having no one to share the good days with, or help shoulder the hard ones." His words struck uncomfortably close to Ellen's own hidden thoughts. How many times had she looked across her empty table and felt the weight of solitude pressing down? How many victories and sorrows had she faced alone, with only Bear to witness? "The way you took me in," Adriel continued, his voice gentle but certain, "the care you showed a stranger who might have been anyone, that speaks to the kind of person you are. I've watched how you keep this place, how you work with quiet dignity despite being alone. I've seen your strength, but also the softness you try to hide." Ellen felt heat rise to her face. "You don't know anything about me," she protested, but the words lacked conviction. "I know you pray when you think no one's listening," he said quietly. "I know you keep your husband's tools cleaned and oiled, ready for use, even though it must pain you to look at them. I know you feed the wild birds even when supplies are scarce, and that you mend your quilts with stitches so tiny they're almost invisible." She stared at him, startled by how much he'd noticed in so short a time. That's nothing special. Just the way things need doing." "It's everything special," he countered. "It's the difference between surviving and living, between a house and a home." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent on hers. "I'm not asking out of gratitude, though I'll be forever grateful for what you did. I'm asking because in these few days, God has shown me something I've been blind to all these years, that a life lived alone isn't really living at all." Ellen felt something inside her soften, like ice beginning to thaw. The sincerity in his voice, the careful way he laid out his heart. It touched places in her she'd thought frozen solid after Thomas's death. Yet fear still coiled in her stomach, cold and familiar. "Mr. Hale, Adriel," she began, not even noticing she'd used his given name. This is—" She struggled to find words that wouldn't hurt him while still protecting her scarred heart. "Marriage isn't something to rush into. We hardly know each other, and I've learned the hard way that good intentions aren't always enough." Before Adriel could respond, Bear's head snapped up, his ears pricking forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he moved to the door, hackles rising slightly. Ellen rose, grateful for the interruption. "What is it, boy?" Bear's bark split the morning quiet, not his warning bark for predators, but the sharp announcement of approaching visitors. Through the window, Ellen caught movement in the thinning snow. Horses, at least 3 of them, picking their way carefully down the trail toward her cabin. The moment shattered like ice in spring thaw, leaving Ellen's heart pounding for entirely different reasons now. Who would be traveling in such conditions? And why were they headed for her isolated homestead? She glanced at Adriel and found him already on his feet, his expression alert but calm. Whatever his answer might have been to her half-formed rejection, it would have to wait. The morning's unexpected proposal hung between them, unresolved, as Bear's barking heralded the approach of unknown riders through the crystal winter morning. The pounding of hooves grew louder as Ellen moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, she could make out 3 riders emerging from the swirling snow. Their dark shapes materialized slowly, like spirits rising from the white void. Bear's barking grew more insistent. "Stay back from the window," Adriel said quietly, moving to stand near the hearth. His face had gone still, but Ellen could see tension in the set of his shoulders. The riders drew up before her cabin, their horses' breath steaming in the cold morning air. Frost coated their heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, making them look like creatures carved from ice. Ellen recognized the badge glinting on the chest of the lead rider, a deputy's star. Bear growled low as boots crunched in the snow outside. A sharp knock rattled the door. "Mrs. Wade?" a deep voice called. "Deputy Cal Anders here. Need to have a word with you, ma'am." Ellen glanced at Adriel, who gave her the slightest nod. She smoothed her apron with trembling hands and opened the door, keeping her body positioned to block the view inside. "Deputy Anders," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "What brings you out in such weather?" The man before her was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with hard eyes set in a weather-beaten face. Ice crystals clung to his dark mustache and the collar of his heavy coat. Two other men flanked him, their expressions equally grim. "Tracking a fugitive, ma'am," Anders said, his gaze trying to pierce past her into the cabin's interior. "Man named Adriel Hale. We have reason to believe he might have passed this way during the storm." Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. "What's he wanted for?" The deputy's jaw tightened. "Murder. He killed my brother James in a mining camp brawl 6 months back. Been hunting him since." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You seen anyone matching his description? Tall fellow, dark hair, carries a Winchester rifle?" Behind her, Ellen could feel Adriel's presence like a physical weight, though she knew he must have moved out of sight. She thought of his gentle hands stacking firewood, his quiet prayers, the way he'd looked at her across the breakfast table moments ago. The word murder seemed impossible to reconcile with the man she'd come to know. "No, deputy," she said, the lie falling from her lips more easily than she'd expected. "I've been alone here since the storm hit, except for Bear." The hound had gone quiet at her side, though his hackles were still raised. One of the other riders, a weathered man with a graying beard, spoke up. "Mind if we have a look around inside, ma'am? Man could have broke in while you were sleeping." Ellen's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "I'm afraid I do mind, sir. My husband may be dead these 2 years, but I still keep a proper home. I don't let strange men inside without cause." "This is cause, Mrs. Wade," Deputy Anders said, his voice hardening. "We're following the law here." "Do you have a warrant, Deputy?" Ellen asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. Anders' face darkened. "No, ma'am, we don't. Storm's made it impossible to reach the judge. But this man's dangerous." "Then I'm afraid I must ask you to respect my privacy," Ellen cut in, drawing herself up to her full height. "I've told you true. There's no one here but me and my dog. If I see anyone matching your description, I'll send word to town straight away." The deputy studied her face for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his frustration. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Very well, ma'am. We'll be checking the ravine trail. If you're lying to us—" He let the threat hang unfinished in the frosty air. Ellen met his gaze steadily, though her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. "I understand my duty to the law, Deputy Anders. Good day to you." She watched as the 3 men remounted, their horses' hooves cutting dark crescents in the snow as they turned toward the ravine trail. Only when they had disappeared into the swirling white did she close the door, her hands shaking as she threw the bolt. The cabin seemed unnaturally quiet after their departure. Ellen turned to find Adriel standing by the hearth, his face drawn with guilt and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that made her heart ache. "I never meant him harm," he said softly, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "James Anders. It was a drunken fight that went wrong. He pulled a knife." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But that don't matter now. I need to go before they come back. You've done more than enough for me already." He moved toward his coat, but Ellen stepped between him and the door. "No." Adriel blinked, surprised. "Mrs. Wade, Ellen, you don't understand. If they find me here, you'll be charged with harboring a fugitive. I won't bring that trouble to your door." "You'll freeze to death out there," Ellen said firmly, "or they'll catch you in the open. Either way, that's not justice." "It's not your burden to bear," he protested. Ellen felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "I've watched you these past days, seen how you work, how you pray, how you treat others with kindness. Maybe I don't know everything about your past, but I know what I've seen with my own eyes. There's more to this story than what Deputy Anders is telling, and you deserve a chance to be heard proper." Adriel stared at her, something like wonder crossing his weathered features. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" Ellen thought about the gentle way he'd mended her corral gate, the reverence in his voice during prayer, the careful respect he'd shown her home and privacy. She thought about his marriage proposal, spoken with such honest hope despite his own troubled past. "Because my conscience tells me it's right," she said simply, "and because I've learned that sometimes the law and justice ain't always the same thing." She moved to the window, watching snow begin to fall again. "The storm's picking up. They won't be able to search much longer today. We can hide you in the root cellar if they come. Back. Once the weather clears, we'll figure out how to get you to a proper trial where you can tell your side." Adriel stood silent for a long moment, his eyes bright with emotion. "I don't deserve such kindness." "That's not for you to decide," Ellen said softly. "Now help me move these supplies to make room in the cellar. And Adriel?" She paused, meeting his gaze. "I'm trusting my judgment here. Don't make me regret it." He nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Ellen. Whatever comes, I won't bring shame to your trust." Together they began clearing space in the root cellar, working quickly and quietly as the wind picked up outside. Ellen's heart still raced when she thought of Deputy Anders' hard eyes, but a deeper certainty had taken root in her soul. She might not be ready to answer Adriel's proposal, but she knew with absolute clarity that she couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man face injustice, not while she had the power to help. Bear settled by the door, his watchful eyes fixed on the snowy path outside. Ellen and Adriel worked in companionable silence, preparing a hiding place while the storm mounted its defense around them. There would be consequences to her choice, Ellen knew, but for now, she felt a curious peace. Sometimes, she was learning, the hardest path was also the truest. Ellen's hands trembled as she rolled back the worn rug, revealing the trap door to her root cellar. The wooden planks felt rough beneath her fingers as she lifted it, careful not to make any noise that might carry beyond the cabin walls. Below, darkness yawned like an open mouth. "It ain't much," she whispered to Adriel, "but it'll keep you safe." Adriel nodded, studying the narrow ladder that descended into the black space. "I've sheltered in worse places, Mrs. Wade. This is more than generous." The root cellar was barely tall enough for a man to stand, its earthen walls lined with shelves of preserved foods and supplies. Ellen had cleared a small space in one corner, laying down clean straw and her second-best quilt. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Watch your head," she cautioned, as Adriel made his way down. The ladder creaked softly under his weight. Once he reached the bottom, Ellen passed down a water jug and some bread wrapped in cloth. "No light," she warned. "The cellar walls are thick, but we can't risk any glow showing through the floorboards if they come back." I understand. His voice drifted up from the darkness. Thank you, Ellen. She hesitated, then added, I'll bring more food when I can. If you hear anyone approach, I'll keep still as a stone, he assured her. Don't worry about me. Ellen lowered the trap door carefully, wincing at even the smallest sound. She arranged the rug back over it, smoothing out any telltale wrinkles. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving fresh snow against the cabin walls. That night, Ellen lay awake in her bed, listening to the storm's fury. Every creak of the cabin made her start, imagining Deputy Anders and his men returning. Bear kept his post by the door, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. In the darkness, Ellen's mind wandered to the man hidden beneath her floors, wondering if he too lay sleepless in the cold earth. Morning brought another curtain of white, the snow falling so thick it obscured the barn just 30 paces from the cabin. Ellen went about her morning chores with deliberate normalcy, though her ears strained for any sound of approaching horses. When she was certain no one was near, she lifted the trap door and lowered a pot of coffee and a plate of cornbread. Much obliged, Adriel's voice drifted up. Storm still blowing? Harder than ever, Ellen whispered back. No one could navigate these trails now. We're all sealed in until it passes. Days began to blur together as the storm raged on. Ellen developed a routine, checking for riders before lifting the trapdoor 3 times a day to pass down meals and exchange whispered conversations. Sometimes she would sit on the floor near the trapdoor in the evenings, sharing quiet words with Adriel through the planks. It was during one such evening, as the wind howled outside like a living thing, that Adriel finally spoke of that fateful night at the mining camp. James Anders was drunk, he said, his voice barely audible through the floor. Not just regular drinking drunk, but mean drunk. He was threatening folks with a pistol, wild-eyed and dangerous. I tried to talk him down, get him away from the crowd. Ellen sat silent, her hands folded in her lap as she listened. He wouldn't listen. Started waving that gun around, finger on the trigger. I reached for his arm, trying to point it away from the crowd. We struggled. Adriel's voice caught. The gun went off. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he realized he'd been shot with his own bullet. I tried to help him, Ellen. I swear I did. But he was gone before the doctor could arrive. Why didn't you stay to tell your side? Ellen asked softly. I meant to, but when Cal Anders arrived and saw his brother dead... Adriel sighed heavily. The look in his eyes, he'd already decided I was guilty. Wouldn't hear any different. Some of the miners warned me he was gathering men to come after me. Said he didn't plan on waiting for any trial. So I ran. Been running ever since. Ellen absorbed this in silence, her heart aching for both brothers, one dead, one consumed by vengeance, and for the gentleman whose attempt to prevent tragedy had only drawn him into its web. The next evening, it was Ellen who found herself speaking of the past, the words spilling out like water from a cracked vessel. She told Adriel about her husband, Thomas Wade, how he'd seemed so kind and steady during their courtship, but how drink had turned him mean after their 2nd year of marriage. He never hit me, she said, staring into the firelight. But his words cut deeper than any blow could have. Nothing I did was ever good enough. The house was never clean enough. The meals never tasty enough. The work never fast enough. When our boy came along, her voice caught. You don't have to tell me, Adriel said gently through the floorboards. No, I want to, Ellen insisted, wiping her eyes. Little Samuel was the light of my life. Even Thomas seemed better when he was around. But then the influenza came through. Samuel took sick first. Thomas was away drinking, like usual. I nursed our boy alone for 3 days, watching him burn with fever, praying harder than I'd ever prayed. She paused, gathering strength. When Samuel died, I had to dig the grave myself. Thomas showed up 2 days later, crying and apologizing like he always did. But something in me had broken. I couldn't forgive him anymore. He drank harder after that, if you can believe it. One night he rode out in a storm worse than this one. They found his horse 2 days later, but never found him. "I'm so sorry, Ellen." Adriel's voice was thick with emotion. "I stopped praying after Samuel died," she admitted. "Figured God had stopped listening anyway. But these past few days, seeing your faith even in the midst of your troubles, it stirred something in me I thought was dead." Through the floorboards, she heard Adriel begin to pray softly. His words weren't the formal church prayers she remembered, but simple, honest words that spoke of pain and hope, forgiveness and healing. Without realizing it, Ellen found herself mouthing the words along with him. The days continued to pass, marked by shared meals and quiet conversations. Ellen told Adriel about her dreams for the ranch, how she'd learned to do everything herself out of necessity, but had come to find pride in her independence. Adriel spoke of his years in the mountains, the beauty and solitude he'd found there, and his growing certainty that God was calling him to put down roots at last. One evening, as Ellen sat by the trapdoor mending a shirt by lamplight, Adriel's voice drifted up with unusual hesitation. "Ellen, about what I asked you that morning, before the deputy came." "The proposal," she said softly. "Yes, I know it was sudden, maybe foolish, but I meant it, still do. These days hidden here, talking with you, sharing our burdens, they've only made me more certain." Ellen's hand stilled on her sewing. "Adriel, you're still in danger. We don't know what's going to happen when this storm clears." "I know," he said, "and I won't hold you to any answer now. Just wanted you to know my heart hasn't changed." Ellen felt tears prick at her eyes. "You're a good man, Adriel Hale. Better than I deserve." "Now that ain't true," he said firmly. "You're the one risking everything to shelter a wanted man, just because your conscience tells you it's right. That's real courage, Ellen. Don't sell yourself short." The storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. Every evening, Ellen and Adriel prayed together through the floorboards, their whispered words a shield against the darkness outside. During the days, Ellen found herself humming as she worked, something she hadn't done since Samuel was alive. But she couldn't forget the danger that waited beyond the storm. Each morning she checked the sky anxiously, knowing that when the weather finally cleared, they would have to face what came next. For now, though, the snow kept falling, and in its cold embrace, 2 wounded souls found a measure of healing through whispered confessions and shared prayers in the dark. Bear kept his vigil by the door, his presence a comfort as Ellen moved through her days with their precious secret. In the root cellar below, Adriel waited patiently, his faith steady as a compass pointing true north. And above them all, the storm raged on, as if nature itself was conspiring to give these 2 lonely hearts the time they needed to find their way toward each other. At night, Ellen would often lie awake, listening to the wind's mournful song. Sometimes she thought she could hear Adriel praying softly below, his words too faint to make out, but their rhythm as soothing as a lullaby. In those moments, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years, as if God's mercy, like the snow outside, was slowly covering all the painful parts of her past in a blanket of pure white. The howling wind showed no signs of mercy on the 3rd morning. Ellen stood at her frost-covered window, watching white sheets of snow dance across the landscape. The storm's persistence had become both a blessing and a curse. It kept the deputies away, but also threatened their dwindling supplies. She knelt by the trap door, her skirts rustling against the rough floorboards. Adriel, I reckon you must be getting awful stiff down there. I'm managing just fine, ma'am, came his muffled reply, though she detected a slight strain in his voice. Ellen glanced at the window, ensuring no shadows moved beyond the swirling snow. The storm's still fierce as ever. Maybe you could come up for a spell, just to stretch your legs proper. She lifted the trap door, and Adriel emerged slowly, like a bear waking from winter sleep. His joints crackled as he straightened, and Ellen noticed how he winced slightly. The root cellar, while safe, was hardly comfortable for a man of his size. "Much obliged," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark beard, and Ellen found herself noticing how his eyes crinkled warmly at the corners when he smiled. They settled by the crackling fire, its heat a welcome comfort after the cellar's chill. Ellen brought out her mending basket, some torn shirts and socks that needed attention. Adriel picked up a piece of pine wood he'd kept in his coat pocket and pulled out his whittling knife. The quiet domesticity of the moment struck Ellen as strange, yet somehow right. The only sounds were the fire's pop and crackle, the whisper of thread through fabric, and the soft scraping of Adriel's knife against wood. "What are you making?" Ellen asked, threading her needle with practiced ease. "Thought I'd try my hand at some spoons," Adriel replied, his big hands moving with surprising delicacy over the wood. "Noticed yours are getting worn down." Ellen paused in her mending, touched by his observation. "That's right thoughtful of you." "Least I can do," he said, carefully shaving another curl of wood. "You've shown more courage than most men I've known, sheltering me like this." A blush crept up Ellen's neck, warming her cheeks. "Now don't you start with such nonsense," she scolded, though without heat. "I'm just doing what's right is all." Adriel looked up from his carving, his eyes serious. "There's plenty who wouldn't see it that way. Plenty who'd have turned me over to the deputies without a second thought." "Well, I ain't them," Ellen said firmly, returning to her mending. But she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips when she heard his low chuckle. It struck her then. Laughter. Such a simple sound, yet it had been so long since these walls had heard it. The realization made her throat tight with emotion. As the afternoon wore on, Ellen's worry about their food stores grew harder to ignore. The storm had lasted longer than anyone could have predicted, and her pantry was showing the strain. "We're running low on provisions," she admitted finally, folding the last mended shirt. Adriel nodded, setting aside his nearly finished spoon. "I noticed, but I might have a solution, if you're willing to learn something new." "What did you have in mind?" "Snowshoe hares," he said. "They'll be moving at dusk, looking for food near the tree line. I can show you how to set snares. It's not hard once you know the trick of it." Ellen considered this. She'd never done any trapping before, but necessity had taught her many new skills since Thomas died. "Show me," she said. Using some spare wire and twine, Adriel demonstrated how to make simple snares, his hands guiding hers through the motions. Ellen found herself hyper-aware of his proximity, the gentle way he corrected her technique, the warmth of his breath when he leaned close to inspect her work. When the light began to fade, they bundled up against the cold. Ellen pulled on her husband's old coat, too big but warmer than her own, and they ventured out into the swirling snow. Bear bounded ahead of them, his tail wagging despite the weather. "Hares follow regular paths," Adriel explained, leading her toward the trees. "See these small depressions in the snow? That's their runway. They'll use it again tonight." Ellen watched carefully as he showed her how to set the snares, positioning them at just the right height and securing them properly. His movements were precise, economical, born of years of experience. "You make it look so easy," she said, fumbling slightly with her own snare. "You'll get the hang of it," he assured her. "You've got good hands for detail work. I've seen your mending." They set 6 snares in total, marking each location carefully so they could find them again in the morning. The wind bit at their faces as they worked, but Ellen barely noticed the cold. There was something satisfying about learning a new skill, about working alongside someone who taught with patience instead of criticism. Back in the warmth of the cabin, they shook the snow from their clothes and hung them to dry. Ellen made tea from the last of her dried mint, and they sat close to the fire, letting its heat chase away the chill. As darkness settled outside, Adriel knelt for his evening prayers. But this time, instead of asking for protection or guidance for himself, he prayed for Ellen. "Lord," his deep voice rumbled softly, "watch over this good woman who's shown such mercy to a stranger. Bless her hands that work so hard, her heart that knows such kindness. Give her the peace that's been missing from this house." Ellen closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. The wind still roared outside, but it seemed less threatening now, more like a blanket wrapping around the cabin, holding them in this moment of quiet grace. When she opened her eyes again, she found Adriel watching her with a gentle expression that made her heart flutter strangely. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, like she was something precious, something worth protecting. "You should get some rest," she said softly, breaking the spell before it could overwhelm her. "It's getting late." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. As he prepared to return to the cellar, he paused. "Thank you, Ellen. Not just for the shelter, but for—" He gestured vaguely at the evening they'd shared, seemingly unable to find the right words. "I know," she said simply, because she did. This day had been a gift to her as well, a reminder that loneliness wasn't the only way to live. After Adriel had settled back in the cellar and Ellen had banked the fire for the night, she sat for a long while in her rocking chair. The wind's voice had changed in her ears. Where once it had seemed to mock her solitude, now it sang of possibility, of change, of hearts healing in the midst of storm. Bear lay at her feet, his solid presence a comfort, as always. But for the first time in years, Ellen realized she no longer needed him to be her only companion. Something was growing in this snowbound cabin, something as delicate as a spring seedling, but just as determined to reach toward the light. She touched her cheek where the blush had bloomed earlier, remembering Adriel's words about her courage. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps there was a kind of courage in opening one's heart again, in letting someone else's warmth thaw the frozen places inside. The storm continued its wild dance outside, but within the cabin's walls, a different kind of weather was changing. Like the slow melting of winter ice, Ellen felt the hard shell around her heart beginning to soften, crack, and give way to something new and frightening and wonderful. In the quiet of the night, she found herself doing something she hadn't done since Samuel died. She began to hope. Morning came with an unfamiliar silence. Ellen woke to it first, the absence of howling wind making her ears strain for danger. She sat up in her bed, watching golden light stream through frost-covered windows. The storm had finally broken. Pulling on her shawl, she moved to the window and rubbed a clear spot in the ice with her sleeve. The sight took her breath away. The valley lay transformed, buried under feet of pristine snow that sparkled like diamond dust in the newborn sunlight. Every fence post wore a white cap, and the barn's roof sagged under its heavy winter blanket. A soft creak in the floorboards made her turn. Adriel stood in the doorway from the front room, where he'd been sleeping these past days, having convinced Ellen to let him out of the cellar once they were sure the deputies wouldn't return in such weather. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He moved to stand beside her at the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Like God washed the world clean. The morning light caught his profile, and Ellen noticed the shadows under his eyes had begun to fade. The haunted look he'd worn when she first found him on her doorstep was softening into something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster when she looked at him too long. "We'd best see to the animals," she said, turning away from such dangerous thoughts. "They'll be wanting breakfast, same as us." After a simple meal of the last cornbread, they bundled up against the cold. Ellen handed Adriel her late husband's old snow shovel. She tried not to notice how much better it looked in his hands than it ever had in Thomas's. The work was hard, but necessary. Together they began clearing a path to the barn, taking turns breaking through the deep drifts. The snow came up past their knees in places, and their breath frosted in the crystal-clear air. Ellen's old goat, Bessie, bleated a greeting when they finally reached the barn door. "Poor thing's probably half-starved," Ellen fretted. But when they got inside, they found the goat had managed well enough, nibbling on the hay Ellen had stocked before the storm. The handful of chickens scratched and clucked around their feet, seemingly unbothered by their confinement. While Ellen tended to the animals, Adriel examined the barn structure. "Roof's held up well enough," he said, "but your cabin could use some attention. I noticed some weak spots while I was up there before." Ellen thought of protesting. She'd managed on her own this long. But the memory of last winter's leaks made her reconsider. "If you're feeling strong enough," she said instead. "Strong as I'll ever be, thanks to your care." Isaac smiled, and Ellen had to look away from the warmth in his eyes. They spent the morning working side by side. Adriel climbed onto the cabin roof with careful steps, clearing snow and examining the wooden shingles. Soon, the steady rhythm of his hammer rang out across the pristine valley. Ellen found herself pausing in her tasks just to listen, remembering how silent her homestead had been before he came. The sun climbed higher, and massive icicles began to drip from the eaves. They caught the light like prisms, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the snow. Ellen hadn't noticed such beauty in years, had forgotten how to look for it, perhaps. From above came the sound of humming. Adriel was working on a particularly stubborn section of roof, and the hymn flowed naturally from him as he worked. Ellen recognized it from her childhood church, Amazing Grace, and before she realized what she was doing, she was humming along. The melody wove between them like a thread, connecting past to present. Ellen remembered her mother singing this same hymn while kneading bread, remembered teaching it to little Samuel. The thought of her son didn't bring the usual stabbing pain. Instead, a bittersweet warmth filled her chest. When Adriel finally climbed down from the roof, his cheeks were red from cold and exertion. "That should hold now," he said, brushing sawdust from his borrowed coat. "Though we might want to check it again when—" He stopped himself, and Ellen heard the unspoken assumption in his words, that he would still be here when the next storm came. The moment stretched between them, delicate as a soap bubble. Ellen broke it by suggesting they get warm by the fire, and Adriel nodded gratefully. Inside, they shed their snow-covered outer clothes, and Ellen set about making tea. The familiar routine helped steady her hands, which had begun trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. That night, sleep came easier than it had in years. Perhaps it was the honest tiredness from the day's work, or the knowledge that her roof was finally properly repaired. Or perhaps it was simply knowing she wasn't alone anymore. In her dreams, Ellen walked through summer meadows she hadn't seen since she was a girl back east. The warm air smelled of clover and fresh-cut hay, and somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. She turned toward the sound and saw Samuel, not as he was in his final days, but healthy and strong, chasing butterflies through the tall grass. His laughter rang out again, pure as spring water, and in her dream, Ellen laughed too. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but they weren't the bitter tears she'd grown used to. Something had shifted in her heart, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. The morning brought more gifts. Adriel had risen early and started breakfast. The smell of flapjacks cooking on the griddle filled the cabin with warmth and promise. Ellen came into the kitchen to find him humming again, flipping the cakes with practiced ease. "Where'd you learn to cook?" she asked, reaching for plates. "My mother, before she passed, said every man should know how to feed himself." He slid a perfectly golden flapjack onto her plate. "Though I reckon she'd be surprised to see me cooking for a lady." Ellen felt her cheeks warm at being called a lady. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had used that word for her. She'd been widow or ma'am for so long. They ate together at her small table, sharing the last of the maple syrup she'd traded for in autumn. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the rough-hewn wood glow like honey. Ellen caught Adriel watching her and found she didn't mind. After breakfast, while Ellen washed the dishes, Adriel sat by the fire with something small in his hands. She could hear the soft, scraping sound of his knife against bone, but he kept his work hidden from view. "What are you whittling now?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "Just a notion I had," he replied mysteriously. "Might amount to something, might not." Ellen let him keep his secret, busy with her own tasks. But throughout the morning, she noticed how focused he was on his carving, how carefully he worked at whatever it was. It wasn't until after their midday meal that Adriel finally stood, brushing bone dust from his lap. "Ellen," he said, his voice serious enough to make her stop her sweeping. "I know this ain't proper. Nothing about our situation has been proper from the start. But I meant what I said before, about wanting you for my wife." Ellen's heart began to race as he held out his hand. In his palm lay a ring, carved from elk bone, with intricate patterns running around its circumference. It was beautiful in its simplicity, speaking of hours of patient work and careful attention. "I can't give it to you properly yet," he continued softly. "Not while I'm still hiding here, not until the truth about Cal's brother comes out. But I want you to have it now, as a promise. When the time's right, I'll do this the way you deserve." Ellen stared at the ring, unable to speak. All her careful walls, built up over years of loss and loneliness, seemed to be crumbling in the face of this man's quiet devotion. With trembling fingers, she picked up the ring, marveling at how smooth it felt, how perfectly sized it seemed for her hand. She started, then had to clear her throat. "I'll keep it safe until then." She slipped the ring into her apron pocket, feeling its weight against her leg like a secret hope. Adriel nodded, understanding all she couldn't say. They returned to their tasks, him mending her broken chair, her kneading bread for the evening meal. But something had changed in the air between them. Every time their eyes met, every accidental brush of hands as they worked carried the weight of promise. Outside, the sun continued to shine on the snow-covered valley. Icicles dripped steadily from the eaves, winter's grip beginning to loosen. In the Ituosa barn, Ellen's chickens scratched and pecked. Bessie chewed her cud contentedly, and Bear dozed in a patch of sunlight. Ellen touched her apron pocket throughout the day, feeling the smooth roundness of the ring. Each time, she remembered her dream of Samuel laughing in the meadow. Perhaps it hadn't been just a dream, but a message, permission even, from her boy to be happy again. The day drew to a close with a sunset that painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. Ellen stood in her doorway, watching the light fade from the sky, feeling Adriel's presence behind her like warmth from a fire. She didn't need to turn around to know he was smiling. She could hear it in his breathing, in the way he hummed that hymn again under his breath. This time, when she joined in the melody, she did so openly, letting their voices twine together in the gathering dusk. The sound drifted out over the snow-covered valley, carried on the evening breeze. Not a widow's lonely song anymore, but a duet full of hope and healing. In her pocket, the bone ring waited for its proper moment, smooth and warm against her fingers. For now, that was enough. A week passed like a dream. The constant howl of winter winds finally gave way to the gentler sounds of melting snow and dripping icicles. Each morning brought new signs of the changing season. Patches of brown earth emerging through white drifts, the cheerful songs of returning birds, and most promising of all, thin ribbons of running water where the creek was breaking free of ice. Ellen stood at her cabin door, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The air still held winter's bite, but there was a hint of something softer beneath it, a whisper of spring that made her heart feel lighter than it had in years. Behind her, Adriel moved about the cabin, stoking the morning fire and setting coffee to boil. The domestic sounds of his presence had become as natural as breathing. She smiled, remembering how she'd once treasured her solitude. Now the thought of returning to that lonely existence made her chest ache. "Looks like good hunting weather," Adriel said, coming to stand beside her. His shoulder brushed hers, and Ellen felt the familiar warmth spread through her at his touch. "Might try for a deer today. Our supplies are running low." Ellen nodded. The smokehouse could use filling before the spring thaw brings mud season. She turned to face him, noting how the morning light softened the worry lines around his eyes. "Just be careful. Deputy Anders might still have men watching the valley." "I'll stick to the shadow side of the ridge." He touched her arm briefly. "Don't fret about me. I know these mountains better than any lawman." After breakfast, Ellen watched him check his rifle and gather his hunting gear. She'd grown used to the efficient way he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did. When he pulled on his coat, the one she'd mended after cutting it off him that stormy night, she felt the familiar flutter of concern. "I'll be back before sunset," he promised, reading her expression. "Maybe sooner, if God's willing and the deer are cooperative." "He better be willing," Ellen said with a small smile. "We're down to salt pork and dried beans." Once Adriel disappeared into the trees, Ellen turned to her own tasks. The garden plot behind the cabin needed attention. Frozen soil had to be turned and prepared for spring planting. She gathered her tools and set to work, grateful for the physical labor that kept her mind from worrying. As she worked, Ellen's thoughts drifted to the future. The bone ring in her apron pocket seemed to warm against her leg, reminding her of possibilities she'd thought forever closed to her. She found herself planning beyond the next day or week, imagining summer vegetables growing in neat rows, hearing children's laughter in the yard again. The sun had climbed high when Ellen finally straightened, stretching her aching back. She'd managed to turn a good portion of the soil, though the ground was still hard with frost in places. Looking at her work, she could almost see the corn stalks that would grow there, tall and green in the summer sun. A shot echoed across the valley, a single clean report that told her Adriel had found his quarry. Ellen smiled, picturing the fresh venison they'd have for supper. She'd traded for some dried herbs last fall that would season it perfectly. Sure enough, Adriel returned mid-afternoon, dragging a young buck on a makeshift sledge. His face was flushed with cold and exertion, but his eyes shone with satisfaction. Together they cleaned and butchered the deer with practiced efficiency, storing most of the meat in the smokehouse while keeping the best cuts for their evening meal. "Saw your work in the garden," Adriel said as they washed up afterward. "Got plans for all that turned earth?" "Thought we might try corn this year," Ellen replied, then felt her cheeks warm at the casual way she'd included him in her future. "Corn's a fine idea," he said softly, saving her from her stammering. "Good soil for it here. Could even build a proper corn crib come harvest time." He paused, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Maybe add on to the barn, too. It's sound enough, but small for a growing farm." Ellen's heart quickened at his words. They'd been dancing around talk of the future all week, neither wanting to tempt fate by planning too far ahead. But now, with spring threatening to break winter's hold, it was harder to avoid such thoughts. As evening approached, Ellen prepared their supper while Adriel split more firewood. The venison steaks sizzled in her best iron skillet, filling the cabin with savory aromas. She'd even found a handful of dried berries to add to the cornbread. A celebration of sorts, though she wouldn't say it aloud. They ate by lamplight, the flame casting warm shadows on the walls. Ellen had set her mother's china, plates, saved for special occasions, and opened her last jar of pickled beans. The meal felt different from their usual suppers, touched with something that felt like hope. "Remember that first morning?" Ellen asked, surprising herself by breaking their comfortable silence. "When you just blurted out that proposal?" Adriel chuckled, the sound rich and warm in the quiet cabin. "Not my finest moment of courtship, I'll admit." His eyes met hers across the table, twinkling with humor. "Though in my defense, I was still addled from nearly freezing to death on your doorstep." "Is that your excuse?" Ellen teased, feeling bold in the intimate lamplight. "Here I thought it was my fine nursing skills that turned your head." "That too," he agreed, his voice growing serious. "But mostly it was your heart," Ellen weighed. "The way you took in a stranger, nursed him back to health, then risked everything to protect him." He reached across the table, his rough fingers brushing hers. "A man would be a fool not to want to spend his life with someone like you." Ellen's breath caught at his words. "You still owe me a proper proposal, you know," she managed to say, though her voice wavered. "I do at that." Adriel's smile widened. "Come spring, when all this business with the law is settled, I'll ask you proper, the way you deserve. Maybe even get down on one knee, if my old bones will allow it." The moment hung between them, sweet with promise. Ellen opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat as a sound cut through the evening quiet. The unmistakable rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. They froze, staring at each other across the half-eaten meal. Ellen's heart began to pound as the hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by the crunch of snow under multiple horses. Adriel moved first, extinguishing the lamp with a quick breath. In the sudden darkness, Ellen heard him cross to the window. She joined him, pressing close to peer through a gap in the curtains. The sight made her blood run cold. Deputy Cal Anders sat astride his horse in the yard, his badge catching the last light of dusk. Two other men flanked him, their faces hard in the growing shadows. In Anders' hand was a folded paper that could only be one thing: a warrant. Ellen felt Adriel tense beside her. His jaw tightened, and she knew he was weighing his options, considering the root cellar, the back door, the chances of slipping away in the gathering dark. But something in his posture told her he'd already made his decision. "Ellen," he whispered, turning to face her. In the dim light, his eyes held a mixture of resignation and determination that made her throat tight. "I won't bring trouble to your door again. You've risked enough for me already." "Adriel, no." She grabbed his arm, but he gently disentangled himself. "The law's caught up. just like we knew it would." His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly as they framed her face. "Better to face it now, with dignity, than keep running and put you in more danger." Outside, Deputy Anders' voice carried clearly through the evening air. "Mrs. Wade, we know he's in there. Come out, both of you, nice and peaceful-like." Ellen's fingers found the bone ring in her pocket, clutching it like a talisman. All their dreams of spring planting and barn building seemed to be slipping away like snow melting in the sun. But Adriel's face held no fear, only a quiet resolve that spoke of his unwavering faith that truth would prevail. "Trust in God's plan," he whispered, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead. Then he stepped back, squaring his shoulders as he prepared to face whatever justice or injustice awaited him outside. Through her tears, Ellen watched the man she'd grown to love walk toward her door, his steps measured and dignified. She wanted to call him back, to hide him away again, to protect their fragile dream of a future together. But she knew he was right. Running would only make things worse. The hoofbeats had stopped. Deputy Anders and his men waited in her yard, their shadows long in the dying light. Ellen took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and moved to stand beside Adriel at the door. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The evening shadows stretched long across Ellen's yard as Deputy Anders dismounted, his spurs jingling against the half-frozen ground. His two companions remained on horseback, their hands resting near their gun belts. Ellen felt Adriel tense beside her on the porch, but his face remained calm, almost serene in the fading light. "Evening, Deputy," Adriel said quietly. "I reckon you've come a fair way through the snow." Anders' face hardened as he reached into his coat. "Save your pleasantries, Hale. I've got what I need right here." He pulled out 2 folded papers, holding them up like weapons. "First, a warrant for your arrest, signed by Judge Wilson himself. Second," he paused, his lips curling into a bitter smile, "something mighty interesting we found among your belongings at your camp." Ellen stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What belongings? You had no right—" "We had every right, ma'am," Anders cut her off. "Man's wanted for murder, we can search his property." He unfolded the second paper, the yellowed document crackling in the cold air. "This here's a claim deed. Shows Hale had himself a nice stake in the same mine my brother was working. Funny how that detail slipped his mind." Adriel shook his head slowly. "That deed ain't what you think, Deputy. Your brother offered to sell me his share, that's true enough. But I turned him down. That paper's just a draft he drew up, never signed or filed." "Liar!" Anders spat the word, his composed demeanor cracking. "You killed him for that claim. Waited till he was deep in his cups, then picked your moment. Made it look like a brawl gone wrong, didn't you?" "No." Adriel's voice remained steady, though Ellen could see the pain in his eyes. "I tried to stop. Him, Cal. He was drunk, waving that pistol around. I only wanted to get it away from him before someone got hurt. We struggled and—" He trailed off, the memory clearly haunting him. Ellen couldn't stay silent any longer. "Listen to him, Deputy. Does this sound like a man who'd kill for gold? He's been here these past weeks, helping me with my farm, praying every day, showing nothing but kindness." "Careful, Mrs. Wade," Anders warned, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You're already skating mighty close to charges yourself. Harboring a fugitive's a serious offense. Only reason I haven't arrested you too is out of respect for your situation, being a widow and all." Ellen lifted her chin defiantly. "That deed proves nothing. It's not even signed. You're twisting evidence to fit what you want to believe because you're grieving. I understand that, but you understand nothing." Anders's shout echoed across the yard, startling a few crows from a nearby tree. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to collect himself. "I'm riding to fetch Sheriff Briggs. He'll want to see this evidence himself. You two stay put. My men here will keep watch. Try to run, and it'll only go worse for you both." Adriel nodded once, accepting. "We'll be here, Deputy." Anders mounted up, casting one last dark look at them before turning his horse toward town. The two guards settled in, one taking position near the barn, while the other remained by the front gate. Ellen and Adriel went back inside, where the remains of their interrupted supper still lay on the table. The venison had grown cold, the cornbread untouched. Their celebration turned to ashes. Ellen began mechanically clearing the dishes, needing something to do with her trembling hands. "Ellen?" Adriel's voice was gentle. "Stop. Come sit with me." She shook her head, gripping a plate so tight her knuckles went white. "This is wrong. All wrong. That deed doesn't prove anything. We can fight this, explain to the sheriff." "Ellen." He crossed to her, taking the plate from her hands and setting it down. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, seeing in his face the decision he'd already made. "No, don't you dare." "I have to go," he said softly. "Tonight, before the sheriff comes, I won't have you charged as an accomplice. These past weeks with you, they've been a gift I never deserved, but I won't repay your kindness by bringing more trouble to your door. You can't just leave." Tears sprang to her eyes. "What about spring planting, the barn? All our plans?" "Plans change," he murmured, brushing a tear from her cheek. "God has his reasons, even when we can't see them clearly." "Then I'll go with you," she insisted. "We can start fresh somewhere else, where no one knows." "And live as fugitives? Always looking over our shoulders, never able to put down roots?" He shook his head. "That's no life for you, Ellen Wade. You've built something here. A home, a future. I won't take that from you." She wanted to argue more, but the truth in his words stopped her. Instead, she pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his scent of pine and leather, trying to memorize everything about this moment. They stood like that for a long while as the cabin grew dark around them. Finally, Adriel stepped back. "I need to write something down. Would you fetch me paper and a pencil?" Ellen did, watching through blur of tears as he sat at the table and carefully wrote by the light of a single candle. When he finished, he folded the paper and reached into his pocket, pulling out the carved elk bone ring he'd made her. "I meant to give you this proper come spring," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Guess that'll have to wait for another life." He placed both items on the table, then stood. "Best if you're asleep when I go. Makes it easier to explain to the deputy that you didn't know." "I won't sleep," Ellen protested. But even as she said it, exhaustion from the emotional day weighed on her. "Try," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "For me." She must have dozed off despite herself, because when she jolted awake, the cabin was dark and cold. The candle had burned out, and Adriel was gone. Only the note and ring on the table proved he'd been real at all. Ellen stumbled to the table, hands shaking as she unfolded the paper. In the gray, pre-dawn light filtering through the windows, she read, "Dearest Ellen, you saved more than my life that stormy night. You saved my faith in God's mercy and my belief in human kindness. I go now not in fear, but in trust that the truth will prevail. Keep the ring, not as a reminder of what might have been, but as a promise of what still could be, if the Lord wills it. With eternal gratitude and love. Adriel." The paper crumpled in her hands as sobs racked her body. She sank to her knees, clutching the ring to her heart as dawn broke over the valley. Outside, she could hear the deputies stirring, discovering Adriel's absence. Soon they would come questioning, demanding to know when he'd left and where he'd gone. But for now, Ellen stayed on her knees, weeping for the man who'd chosen to walk away into the cold night, rather than risk bringing harm to her. The man who'd shown her that love wasn't about possession or control, but about sacrifice and trust in God's greater plan. The elk bone ring warmed in her palm as the first rays of sunlight touched it, and Ellen knew that whatever came next, she would hold on to her faith, in God's mercy, in justice, and in the pure love of a man who'd rather surrender himself than see her suffer. Through her tears, she whispered a prayer. Lord, keep him safe, and if it be your will, bring him back to me. The morning after Adriel's departure dawned with an eerie stillness. No wind stirred the bare branches, and even the chickens seemed subdued, as if nature itself held its breath. Ellen hadn't slept more than a few fitful moments since discovering him gone. Her eyes were raw from crying, but she'd run out of tears. She sat at her rough-hewn table, reading his note for the 100th time. The paper had already grown soft from handling, but the words remained clear. You gave me warmth. I'll meet you at sunrise, if the Lord wills. The elk bone ring lay beside it, catching the pale morning light. Deputy Anders and his men had discovered Adriel's absence at first light. They'd stormed into her cabin, demanding answers she truthfully couldn't give. She'd been asleep when he left. That much was honest. They'd searched every corner of her property before riding off in pursuit, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the weight of decision pressing on her heart. Ellen moved through her morning chores mechanically, feeding the chickens, milking her goat, checking the wood supply. But her mind was miles away, following the trail she imagined Adriel taking through the melting snow. The thought of him facing judgment alone twisted something deep in her chest. By mid-morning, she couldn't bear it any longer. I won't let him stand alone, she whispered to the empty cabin. Her words seemed to break some invisible barrier, spurring her into action. She packed quickly but thoroughly. Dried beef, hard biscuits, an extra blanket, and a change of clothes. Her hands trembled as she filled her canteen, but her movements were sure. She'd survived alone for years by being practical, and those skills served her now. Bear whined at her feet as she gathered her supplies. You'll have to stay here, old friend, she told the hound, scratching behind his ears. Guard the place. Mrs. Peterson will look in on you. Her elderly neighbor had always been kind about checking on things when Ellen needed to ride into town for supplies. The mare, Shadow, snorted and stamped as Ellen saddled her. The horse seemed to sense her urgency, dancing sideways as Ellen tightened the cinch. The morning had warmed enough to turn the top layer of snow to slush, making the footing treacherous. Ellen knew she'd have to ride careful and steady, no matter how her heart urged her to hurry. She mounted up, patting Shadow's neck as the mare found her footing in the muddy yard. Ellen took one last look at her cabin, the home she'd built from grief and determination after burying her first husband and child. For years, it had been her fortress against the world. Now, for the first time, she was riding away not to trade goods or buy supplies, but to fight for someone else's future. The trail to Fairplay wound through stands of pine and aspen, crossing several streams that ran high with snowmelt. Ellen kept to the most traveled paths, knowing they'd be safest. Still, Shadow had to pick her way carefully around patches of ice, hiding under the mud. The spring sun was warm on Ellen's face, but the wind carried winter's bite. She pulled her wool scarf higher, grateful for the extra layers she'd packed. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, sharper, more alive. Or maybe she was the one who had changed, awakened from a long winter of her own. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ellen spotted the way station, a sturdy log building that served as rest stop for mail carriers and travelers. Smoke rose from its chimney, promising warmth and maybe news. Shadow was tired from negotiating the treacherous trail, and Ellen knew they both needed rest. The station keeper, a gruff man named Morton, nodded at her entrance. A mail driver sat near the pot-bellied stove, warming his hands around a tin cup of coffee. Ellen recognized him as Jim Hawkins, who ran the route between Fairplay and Denver. "Evening, Mrs. Wade," Morton said, already reaching for another cup. "Bit late in the day for you to be traveling." "Important business in town," Ellen replied, accepting the offered coffee gratefully. The warmth spread through her cold fingers. "Heard about that business," Jim spoke up, his weathered face grave. "They caught themselves a mountain killer, way I hear it. Sheriff's holding him now." Ellen's hands tightened around her cup. "A killer? You mean Adriel Hale?" "That's the name," Jim nodded. "Deputy Anders was in a state about it, riding through yesterday. Said the man killed his brother over a gold claim." He studied Ellen's face. "You know something about it?" "I know Adriel Hale isn't a killer," Ellen said firmly. "He's a good man who tried to stop a tragedy, nothing more." Morton and Jim exchanged looks. "Well," Morton said carefully, "Sheriff's a fair-minded man. He'll sort it out." Ellen hoped he was right. She spent a restless night on one of the station's narrow cots, her mind full of images of Adriel in chains. The elk bone ring hung from a leather cord around her neck, a constant reminder of why she rode. Dawn found her back in the saddle, Shadow refreshed from the night's rest. The trail improved as she neared town, the mud giving way to more traveled paths. By noon, she caught her first glimpse of Fairplay's snow-dusted buildings through the trees. The town hadn't changed since her last visit months ago. The same wooden sidewalks, the same false-fronted stores, the same mix of miners, merchants, and mountain folk going about their business. But everything felt different now. Her heart pounded as she rode past the general store where she usually traded eggs and butter. Today she had bigger concerns than commerce. The jailhouse sat at the end of Main Street, a solid building of stone and thick timber. Ellen tied Shadow to the hitching post, taking a moment to steady her nerves before climbing the steps. The deputy at the desk looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Wade," he said, neither friendly nor hostile. "Figured you might show up." "I need to see him," Ellen said simply. The deputy hesitated, then nodded toward a door. "Sheriff's in there with him now. You can wait." Ellen sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them from shaking. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the inner door opened. Sheriff Briggs emerged, a tall man with steel-gray hair and tired eyes. He looked Ellen over thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wade," he said, "I understand you've been harboring my prisoner." "I've been sheltering an innocent man," Ellen corrected, meeting his gaze steadily. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Come on, then. He's been asking after you." He led her down a short hallway to the cells. Adriel sat on a narrow cot, his head bowed as if in prayer. He looked up as they approached, and Ellen's heart clenched at the peaceful expression on his face. He showed no fear, no anger, just the calm of a man who'd made his peace with God. "Ellen," he said softly, rising to approach the bars. "You shouldn't have come." "Don't tell me what I shouldn't do, Adriel Hale," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "You don't get to face this alone." The ghost of a smile touched his lips, still as stubborn as ever. "You can have a few minutes," Sheriff Briggs said. "I'll be in my office." He walked away, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Ellen reached through the bars, taking Adriel's calloused hands in hers. They were warm and solid, just as she remembered. "Tell me what happened," she said. "All of it. I need to understand." Adriel's thumbs traced circles on her palms as he spoke. "I was trading pelts in the mining camp when Cal's brother started waving that pistol around. He was drunk, angry about claim boundaries. I tried to talk him down, then tried to get the gun away when words didn't work. We struggled. The gun went off." His voice caught. "I never meant him harm, Ellen. I've asked God's forgiveness 1,000 times, but I can't forgive myself." "There were witnesses?" "A few. Most were as drunk as he was. But there's one, a storekeeper named Wilson. He was sober, saw it all. But he left camp that same night, headed for Denver, they said." Ellen squeezed his hands. "Then we'll find him. The truth will come out." "Ellen," Adriel's voice was gentle but firm, "I won't have you running all over the territory on my account. What happened was God's will. I accept that." "Well, I don't," Ellen said fiercely. "God didn't bring you to my door in that blizzard just to see you hang for an accident. He gave you to me for a reason, Adriel Hale, and I aim to find out what it is." Emotion flickered across his face. "You've changed," he said softly. "You changed me," she replied. "You showed me that faith isn't just about accepting what comes. It's about fighting for what's right." She touched the ring hanging from her neck. "You said you'd meet me at sunrise, if the Lord wills it. Well, I'm here to make sure he does." Ellen stood before Sheriff Briggs's desk, her hands clasped tightly. "Please, Sheriff. He deserves a proper hearing." The lawman studied her for a long moment. "5 minutes, Mrs. Wade. That's all I can spare." Back at Adriel's cell, he gripped the iron bars. "Don't risk. Your good name for me, Ellen." "I'll testify to who you really are," she insisted. "To everything I've seen." "There's something else," Adriel said quietly. "A Ute boy saw the whole thing that night. If someone could find him—" Ellen's heart leapt. "I will." Outside the brick church, she found Reverend Marsh tending his garden. When she explained, his kind eyes softened. "I'll send telegrams to every settlement," he promised. That evening, Ellen knelt at the altar rail for the first time in years. "Lord," she whispered, "show us the way." The county courthouse buzzed with whispers as townsfolk packed the wooden benches. Ellen's boots echoed on the floorboards as she approached the witness stand. Though her hands trembled, her voice rang clear as she testified about Adriel's character, his nightly prayers, his gentle ways, how he'd saved her life in the blizzard. Deputy Anders stood, face hard. "Your Honor, I present this gold claim deed as evidence of his greed." He slapped the paper onto the judge's desk. The judge adjusted his spectacles. "I'll delay sentencing until we locate this Ute witness." As evening snow began falling, Ellen waited on the church steps, wrapping her shawl tighter. Reverend Marsh emerged with news. "The telegram reached the agency post," he said softly. "We must keep praying." At first light on the third day, wooden wheels clattered on the muddy street as a weather-beaten wagon from the Ute agency rolled into town. Tavo, the young scout, jumped down from the seat, his moccasins splashing in half-frozen puddles. His breath came in quick clouds as he rushed toward the courthouse steps. Inside, before the packed room, Tavo's clear voice cut through the silence. "Adriel Hale tried to stop the fighting," he declared, meeting the judge's eyes. "Anders's brother was drunk. He tripped and fell on his own gun." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Deputy Anders staggered backward, his face draining of color. He turned and stumbled out the door, shoulders bent with shame. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Case dismissed. Mr. Hale, you're free to go." Ellen's tears flowed freely as Adriel grasped Tavo's hand, his own trembling with gratitude. The townspeople parted silently, making way as they walked toward the door. Outside the courthouse, water dripped steadily from the icicles hanging along the eaves. The morning sun caught each drop, turning them to diamonds before they fell. Adriel looked at Ellen, his eyes bright with purpose. Without warning, he knelt in the muddy street before her. His weathered hands held out the elk bone ring she remembered from that night in her cabin. "Ellen Wade," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you let me build the rest of my life beside you?" Ellen's laugh bubbled up through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The townspeople who had gathered to watch the trial broke into gentle applause. Reverend Marsh stepped forward, raising his hands in blessing over them both as they stood together in the melting snow. Later, they rode home side by side through the valley. The spring sun glinted off the mountain tops, and patches of green showed through the thinning snow. Ellen glanced at her cabin in the distance. For the first time since she'd lost her family, the sight didn't fill her with dread. Instead, it felt like a beginning. Weeks passed, and the mountain valley transformed. Delicate purple crocuses pushed through the melting snow near Ellen's cabin, their brave faces turning toward the strengthening sun. The day of Ellen and Adriel's wedding dawned clear and bright, with wisps of clouds trailing across the Colorado sky. Inside the little mountain church, sunlight streamed through freshly cleaned windows. Ellen wore her best dress, adorned with a spray of early wildflowers. Adriel stood tall in a new shirt, his face clean-shaven and eyes bright with joy. The wooden pews filled with townsfolk who had once doubted him, but now came bearing dishes and well-wishes. Near the front sat the Ute family Adriel had helped through lean times: Running Deer, his wife Morning Sky, and their children. They had brought a beautifully tanned deerskin as a wedding gift, decorated with intricate beadwork that sparkled in the chapel light. Reverend Marsh's voice carried through the small church as he joined their hands. Ellen's fingers trembled slightly in Adriel's steady grip as they spoke their vows. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Bear, who had insisted on attending, let out a happy bark from his spot by the door. After the ceremony, they hosted a simple but joyful supper at their homestead. The cabin seemed to glow with new life. Through the open door, guests could see the roof Adriel had repaired gleaming under the spring sunshine. The corral he had mended now held 3 new calves, their spindly legs wobbling as they nursed from their mothers. Women from town had brought pies and stews, while Running Deer's family shared dried berries and fresh venison. Children played in the yard, their laughter mixing with the sound of snowmelt rushing through the valley below. Deputy Anders himself came bearing a peace offering, a fine set of iron cookware, and his heartfelt apology. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, the guests gradually departed with final congratulations and hugs. Ellen and Adriel settled onto the porch steps, watching the last rays of light dance across the peaks. The evening air held the promise of spring, though patches of snow still lingered in the shadows. Ellen leaned her head against her new husband's shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and leather that always seemed to cling to him. "You were freezing when I found you," she whispered, remembering that frightful night that now seemed so long ago. Adriel's arm tightened around her shoulders as he smiled. "And you were the fire God sent," he replied softly, his voice full of gratitude and love. Together they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rushing meltwater and the evening songs of returning birds. Their home stood strong behind them, a testament to healing and hope. Where once Ellen had known only loneliness and Adriel only guilt, now they had found something precious, a love built on mercy, strengthened by faith, and blessed with the promise of all the days to come. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.